مرحبا وأهلا بكم في برنامج داخل واشنطن. معكم مضيفكم روبرت ساتلوف. إنه جاسوس سابق ضمن مجموعة من القادة تضم دبلوماسيين ورجال دولة. يتزعم دولة كبيرة خاوية لا تنتج سوى القليل مما يريد العالم شرائه باستثناء ما تستخرجه من الأرض. معارضوه لا يخسرون الانتخابات وحسب، وإنما كثيرا ما يختفون بشكل غامض أو يلقون مصيرهم في غرف فندقية نائية. وقد أثر حتى الآن 4 رؤساء أمريكيين، وربما يكون قد لعب دورا في انتخاب آخرهم. الرجل هو فلاديمير بوتين رئيس روسيا، وهو في وسط ما قد يشكل أخطر أزمة دستورية في مضمار السياسة الأمريكية منذ فضيحة ووترغيت التي شهدتها إدارة نيكسون. من هو بوتين؟ وماذا يريد؟ وكيف بقى على قمة هرم السلطة في روسيا لما يقرب من عقدين؟ وكيف من المفترض بالولايات المتحدة التآتي معه؟ لمناقشة سياسة الولايات المتحدة هي روسيا والأزمة المتفاقمة للتدخل الروسي في النظام الانتخابي الأمريكي، يسرني أن أرحب بالخبيرين بارزين في مجال السياسة الخارجية هما دينيس وبراين ماكيون. Welcome back to Dakhel Washington. Today we're talking about what might be one of the most important foreign policy relationships the United States has, and that's with Russia. Sometimes good, sometimes bad, but never easy, and certainly that applies in this administration. I'm delighted to welcome Brian Makion and Denis Ross to talk about these issues. Gentlemen, welcome.
Thank you.
So let's start at the beginning. Vladimir Putin. Who is he? How has he stayed president of Russia so long? And what does he want? Brian?
Well, he's a former KGB agent turned politician who has managed to stay in power over several decades, even the period where he was not president, and he let Mr. Medvedev be the president. He was behind the scenes, at least concurring in what was going on, if not actively managing it. And he's done it in a Russian way through a bit of kleptocracy and encouraging oligarchs to take their cut of the economic pie and stay out of his politics. He made a bargain with Russian business and Russian people that he would try to lift standards of living from where they were in the 1990s, which were not very strong, as long as he had a free hand to run the country. That's who he is and how he stayed in power.
And Denis, what does Putin want?
You know, Putin was heavily shaped by the kind of collapse of the Soviet Union. You know, he referred to the collapse of the Soviet Union as the worst geopolitical tragedy of the 20th century. I'm not even sure it was the worst tragedy for Russia itself, but it kind of speaks volumes for him. The collapse he saw as producing chaos, weakness. So in the first instance, what he wants to do is to ensure a kind of stability as he defines stability. His broader objective, and he uses this to gain a kind of domestic support, and he has significant domestic popularity, is to show that he's restored Russia's status on the world stage. I think we've never fully understood or appreciated the kind of psychological trauma that the collapse of the Soviet Union, the loss of power, status, stature, had on the body politic. It's true there was chaos economically and people suffered a great deal, but that was only part of the trauma. A major part of the trauma was the sense that the Soviet Union, Russia, was somebody respected, had a standing. The state was always more important than the individual in any case in Russian history, and all that was lost. And he's made restoring it, he's made Russia being a central player, respected again, a superpower on par with the United States, a kind of driving mission. And he's used it, as I said, to gain strong domestic approval. So what he wants is to make Russia a player everywhere. One interesting little footnote here. In 1971, Alexei Kosygin was the premier of the Soviet Union, and he said, no problem anywhere in the world can be resolved without the Soviet Union. And what Putin wants is to reestablish that.
But Brian, Russia is fundamentally a weak country. It doesn't produce anything that the world really wants other than what it can take out of the ground. How does Putin compensate for this sort of structural weakness, this shell? How does he do it? How does he get to be the man that everybody wants to meet with and the global leader?
Well, on the international stage, Russia still has a permanent seat on the UN Security Council, so it's a reality that on big international issues, the world has to deal with Russia. The United States needs to deal with Russia in some way. Regionally, within his own near neighborhood in the Middle East and Asia, he has influence either because of the size and presence of Russian interests in these countries, or in his immediate neighborhood through his own political influence and some of the tools of the intelligence statecraft that he uses to either buy supporters through cold hard cash or economic deals. And we've seen more recently in the last several years the kind of activity that we've also seen in the United States, which is intervening in political activity and elections, throwing the weight of the Russian state behind favored candidates or political interests.
So, Denis, Putin, as we said at the outset, has been on the stage since the Clinton administration. So before we start talking about Putin and President Trump, what lessons do you think Putin has taken away from dealing with President Clinton, President Bush, and President Obama in terms of dealing with American presidents?
It's an interesting question. I think that when he came on the scene, he didn't have the kind of confidence that he has today. I saw him in the year 2000, and he was more reserved then. He was still finding his footing. He was still probing. He understood they were weak and we were strong. He also bears a lot of resentment. He felt that the U.S. in the 1990s sought to exploit its strength and to exploit Russia's weakness. And I think he always kind of vowed in his own mind he'd find a way to get back at that, but he didn't have the wherewithal with Clinton. He didn't have the wherewithal with George W. Bush until maybe the very end of the administration. I think what he sought to do was to be on sort of the right side of Clinton and Bush. You know how Bush, after his first meeting with him, said he looked into his eyes and he saw his soul, which is American presidents seemingly like to do that because Franklin Delano Roosevelt said about Stalin, he represents the soul of the Russian people. So somehow it's like they've been reading Dostoevsky, you know, they think about how to talk about that. But
something tells me George W. Bush was not reading Dostoevsky.
Well, Clinton may have. But I do think that he kind of took the measure of the two of them. He saw, okay, I kind of see how you deal with American presidents. With Obama, he also took the measure that Obama wasn't keen to be engaging militarily. Yeah, he was going to be engaged on the international stage, but he could kind of probe and test, and he could get away with it, I think, in his eyes. And his confidence went up because he felt maybe the U.S. was more in a kind of retrenchment phase. And he, I think, reads presidents that way. Now, I think he looks at Trump very differently. I think he feels everything is personalized with Trump in a way that it wasn't with Clinton, it wasn't with Bush, and it wasn't with Obama.
So, Brian, you were close to at least the Clinton and the Obama experiences. What do you take away from Putin's engagement with these administrations?
Well, I don't have much to disagree with about what Denis said and the evolution of Putin. I think the thing to bear in mind, in addition to his prime interest in being a big player on the world stage, is he wants a sphere of influence on his border. It's rooted in centuries of Russian history and paranoia of wanting a buffer, a security against invaders, and he plays an old-fashioned game, which is a sphere of influence. He wants to have it. United States policy, European policy, has been to the contrary, which is we don't believe there are spheres of influence. We think nations should be free to choose their alliances, and our objective since the end of the Cold War, Denis was there as one of the architects with Secretary Baker, is a Europe whole and free and at peace. And he is directly attacking that principle. And right now he's having a little bit of success.
Mm-hmm. Now, I mean, every president seems to come to office with the idea we're going to try to have a reset with Russia. We're going to do our best to get on the best side and get off to the right foot. And they all fail, it seems. Is there any connection, or is it always Putin pushing too far, further than any American president can go?
Well, I think the concept of a reset, which President Obama sought and President Trump apparently seeks, is rooted in part in what we've talked about. Russia, it is a player that has to be dealt with on the international stage. They were important to the success of the Iran nuclear negotiations. They've been important to some of the diplomacy with North Korea. They've at least been maybe not actively helpful, but they've acquiesced in some of the activities that we have undertaken. So the reality is we have to deal with Russia. And in President Obama's first term, there was some modicum of success from the reset. We got a New START treaty that reduced strategic arms between the two countries. We got an agreement with Russia to allow a corridor for the shipment in and out of Afghanistan of our equipment. Very important, because that allowed us to not be only reliant on Pakistan, which is not always a reliable partner in that respect. We helped Russia get into the World Trade Organization. We were trying to continue a long-standing policy of trying to incorporate them into the European Atlantic institutions. So it wasn't all a failure. It just came to a crashing end in 2014 with the invasion of Crimea and the intervention in eastern Ukraine. Mm-hmm. So I think it's natural for a new president to look at it and say, well, that was my predecessor's policies. I'm going to do this differently, and I can start over.
All right. When we come back, we're going to talk about what President Trump has in mind, how it differs from previous presidencies, and what about Russian interference in our election? Is that fundamentally a game changer in U.S.-Russian relations? In just a moment. Our guests today include Brian McCown. Brian has played a central role in the making and execution of U.S. foreign policy for more than a quarter century, serving at the White House, Pentagon, and Congress. Most recently, he was Principal Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Policy in the Obama administration. An attorney by training, he received his undergraduate degree from Notre Dame and his law degree from Georgetown here in Washington. Sitting to his right is Dennis Ross, my colleague and counselor to the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. In President Obama's first term, Dennis spent 3 years in the administration, first in the State Department and then at the White House as Senior Director for the Central Region on the National Security Council. So now let's look at President Trump and President Putin. President Trump came in saying he wants to start anew, build a new relationship. Is there anything wrong with that? And has he gone about it the right way? Dennis?
Well, there are two parts to that question. As Brian was saying, every president takes a look and sees, on issues like proliferation, on terror, on drugs and thugs, the Russians in many areas ought to have the same interests as we do, and frequently for us to be able to deal successfully on these kinds of transnational issues, cooperation from the Russians is going to make it a whole lot easier. I mean, the fact is, if you're going to negotiate something with the Iranians, which the Obama administration did, if the Russians weren't on board with us, that would not have been possible. So there are reasons why any president is going to want to find, in those areas of commonality, a basis on which to cooperate. I do think President Trump, even as a candidate, was making it clear that we had common interests with the Russians on a lot of issues on terrorism, and terrorism seemed to be the president's big preoccupation when it came to foreign policy. So there's a certain logic to it, no question, and that doesn't make him different from his predecessors. What does make him different from his predecessors is what seems to be the inability ever to criticize Russia. I mean, there are those within his administration who do, but he never does. And even the way at the G20 meeting, it's not just that the meeting went on longer than planned, that's fine. But then to seek out, again, a second meeting with nobody else there, the message that is sent is that we need the Russians more than they need us. And I can say, we're dealing with someone like Putin. I've often said about Putin, you know, he is serious and transactional. He's much more a checkers player than a chess player. So he's going to read the signals pretty clearly about what he can do. He's not a big risk taker. You know, you don't send in little green men first if you're a big risk taker.
You mean into Ukraine?
Yeah.
And Crimea.
Crimea, then Ukraine. I mean, he engages in a kind of hybrid warfare, and it gives him a cover and deniability. So he tests what the limits are. He tests if there's going to be pushback. If this president wants to be successful with him, and I believe to some extent you can be successful with Putin because he is transactional, I think the key is to understand what are the limits of the relationship, not to expect more than is possible, understand where there's a common interest and where there isn't, establishing limits with Putin so he understands what our limits are and that there will be serious pushback, and make it clear that while you're prepared to work with him, you're prepared not to seek to be unnecessarily provocative or to put them in the corner. We also won't accept that when they do that to us. And that's why I think the whole issue of the Russian elections, of the Russian meddling in the elections, is something that requires more than just a question, did you do it? Putin needs to see he crossed a threshold there that's wholly unacceptable, and that if we ever see anything like that again, the price that they're going to pay is going to be a price that Putin would consider to be very high.
So, Brian, you look at the Trump-Putin relationship in the first few months of this new administration. How do you evaluate it?
Well, Dennis says a lot that I agree with. The things that I would add would be Putin has broken two pretty big norms in the last 3 years. He invaded a state. The world had accepted that the inviolability of borders and the static nature of borders, because the international system likes stability. And in 1975, the European states, through the Helsinki Final Act, said these are the borders in Europe. In 1990 and 91, the world, the United States, our partners, stood up against Saddam Hussein's effort to wipe away part of the Kuwaiti border by invading its neighbor. We established a principle in rolling that back. And so what Putin did in Crimea and in eastern Ukraine is breaking a huge norm. And we can't just look past that, which the Trump administration appears at various times to want to do. Secondly, as Dennis just said, Russia intervened in our presidential election. It's hard to understand why the president doesn't accept that fact, which the intelligence community and senior leaders from both parties, appointees of both Obama and Trump, have said is a fact. And yet he doesn't yet embrace it. So he's sending, in addition to the signal Dennis just talked about at the G20, he's sending a signal of doubt that what Putin did was really so bad. So I think they're off on the wrong foot in terms of United States interests. If the president wants to pursue valid interests where we have commonality with Russia, that makes sense, I understand that. But we're starting off on the back foot in the way that the president is approaching the relationship.
Let me ask you about Russian interference in the elections. There are those who say, well, you know, great powers do this stuff all the time. We've been messing around in other elections. The Russians mess around in elections. That's just part of being a great power with spies and that sort of thing. Is there something fundamentally new and different about what the Russians did in 2016? Or is it part of a more general global pattern?
I don't think it's part of a general global pattern, because it's really the scope of what they did. First, they used cyber in a way that is far more extensive than anything we've ever seen before. And it was clearly designed to benefit one candidate versus the other. It was clearly designed also to try to create questions and doubts about the legitimacy of the American election. One of the things that drives Putin is to try to show Russia's no different from the United States. He knows it's not a democracy in Russia, but he wants to show, oh, the American democracy isn't so real either. He wanted to play to the sense of, okay, that system is rigged, which unfortunately fit the terminology of a couple of candidates, by the way. It wasn't only what Trump was saying, Bernie Sanders was saying it too, maybe for a different reason. He understands the United States has soft power that is meaningful. It is a model that is attractive. And he wants to undercut that. And the intervention in the election was also part of that. You know, it is a national security issue. He breached a threshold that is unacceptable, intolerable, and he has to understand that he will pay a terrible price as he measures the price if this continues. And as Brian said, the problem is that's not the whole positioning of the president at this point is not to convey that kind of message, whether it's on the intervention in the election or it's the inviolability of borders. Both of those should be principles that are sacrosanct.
All right, gentlemen, we're going to have to leave it there with this issue, and I'm sure we'll be back talking about the U.S.-Russian relationship again before too long. Thank you for joining us this week on داخل Washington. بهذا نصل إلى نهاية هذه الحلقة من برنامج داخل واشنطن. إذا كانت لديكم أي استفسارات أو تعليقات حول هذه الحلقة وخاصة حول الدور الروسي في الانتخابات الأميركية، أرجو أن تراسلوني مباشرة على عنوان البريد الإلكتروني التالي insidewashington@الحرة.com. معكم روبرت ساتلوف. شكرا لكم وإلى اللقاء.